energized not so much by the Islamic revolution, but by the idea that a despotic Shah, a client regime, could be thrown out by the popular will?
Yeah, well, I would say by both. First of all, there was and has been since then an Islamic conscience that has been fermenting in the Middle East. When the Islamic Revolution in Iran took place, it gave a boost, like you said, your word was very accurate, it energized this whole context. And that was bound to have its echo here in the United States among the different Muslims who are here.
Would it be correct to say Islamic energization combined with Arab nationalist energization? I was just coined a word here. But in addition to the fact that it has religious origins, doesn't it also have nationalist origins? Let's get rid of these regimes that don't represent us, that are controlled by the CIA and by Washington. Let's have our own elected officials, just like the decision to elect an imam at your mosque.
Well, as far as I can't speak for Arab nationalists, but as far as those who believe in Arab nationalism as an ideology, I think reading their moves, no, that would not be the case, because Arab nationalists had governments in the Middle East that in one sense or the other represented their version of nationalism, Arab nationalism. You had the Ba'athis in Syria and in Iraq. You had the Nasiri version of Jamal Abdel Nasser's version of Arab nationalism during his heydays in Egypt. Also Gaddafi in Libya and Numayri in Sudan, etc. So the Arab nationalists actually had reached the seats of power, and from there they were playing out their implementation of Arab nationalism. So this is unlike the Muslims.
So you make a clear distinction between the secular nationalists and pan-Arabists, even Nasserites, and this new wave whose origins are deeper and religious.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. The Islamic political awareness was the underground force in the Middle East. Let me take you back to Beirut when I was in college there. We had a small organization of Islamic students on campus in Beirut. This was not the AUB, the American University of Beirut. This was the Arab University of Beirut, which was part of Alexandria University of Egypt. It was the largest campus there. It had about 34,000 students altogether. Now, there were other Arab nationalist student bodies that were permitted to function on campus. But we, an Islamic student body, and this was in the days of Sadat, who was supposed to have been opening up, but at that time, I'm talking about late 60s, early 70s, an Islamic political orientation was not permitted on campus. Step out of campus into, and Lebanon was supposed to be the hub of democracy at that. Remember, Lebanon of the Middle East at that time? There was another attempt at trying to get an Islamic party to function in a legal sense inside of Lebanon. At that time, Kamal Jumblat was the interior minister of Lebanon. He was approached. He was given the whole details of it, just like any interior minister would want them to be. But he said, no, we cannot permit an Islamic political party to function here. So,
all right. I want to go back to this, but I want to integrate it into what we started about, talking about Washington. You were saying that there was a major sea change in the Washington scene in the late 70s, early 80s. Can you pick up that thread, and then we'll integrate it?
That's right. Let's return to that. So here in Washington, as these events, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the assassination of President Anwar Sadat in Egypt, the
Camp David agreements and all, right.
The sellout, the uprising inside of Syria during those days, if you can recall, the invasion of Afghanistan by, at that time, the Soviet Union. All of these affairs and issues and developments converged, and almost from whichever background you came from, whether you are a Muslim from Asia or Africa, you were drawn into this convergence of developments. And so the Muslims here at that time were conscientized to such a degree that they were ready to kick off their authentic, their genuine, their bona fide Islamic associations and organizations here. Enter the ADC, the Zurbi types, the AAUG. They were.
You mean they came along as a control mechanism, as a way of preventing popular groups?
Blocking, as a way of blocking this authentic move, this grassroots move of the Muslims to finally, at the end, represent themselves.
And the Arab regimes were glad to help
of course.
Those like them.
Absolutely. It was the most convenient thing that could happen.
I'm Mark Brzezinski. You're watching Mideast Realities. We're with Mohamed Al-Asi today, and we're discussing everything from the state of the Arab world, the realities of today's Arab world, to how that translates to the realities of the situation in Washington, D.C. It's very interesting. I've been here myself about during the time that you've been here, since the late 70s, and I've witnessed this, of course, from a different perspective, because first of all, I'm a secular person, secondly, I'm Jewish, and in those days, in fact, I was representing the World Jewish Congress, but it was a very different World Jewish Congress. We were as likely to be having lunch or dinner with the PLO as we were to be, in those days, the World Jewish Congress was alienated from AIPAC, the Jewish lobby, and was in the forefront of talking about a Palestinian state and relations with the PLO. World's changed a great deal. You don't know that history. I can see in your eyes that you don't know too much about that period, and I don't know too much about this period. So the organizations that claim to represent Arab Americans today, just like the regimes that claim to represent the Arab world today, were all coming alive and being co-opted and funded and used in this period. So for your purposes, NAAA made an attempt in its early days to be independent, but got totally co-opted and has no grassroots at all. It has no grassroots. It's simply a shell maintained by some fat cats in the Arab world who like to have an escort service when they come to town. Am I wrong? If I am, please tell me.
This is quite interesting to listen to you put it in such a way.
Well, it's TV. We got to put things into a few minutes, even on this program. Zogby came along after helping set up the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, ADC. He was pushed out of ADC when he had a tremendous row with its founder, Senator Abaresk, even though they were similar kinds. And he went off with the help of NAAA to set up so-called Arab American Institute, which is the best you could call it. It's a public relations firm for the fat cat Arab regimes. More in, I'll use the graphic language, I mean, Jim is a political prostitute of the first order. And yet he's the main person you would see on Crossfire or American TV talk shows with the title Arab American Institute after his name. Do any of these organizations, in your judgment, have any real claim to representing Arab American interests and sentiments?
These organizations, on the level of being organizations, represent the Arabs as much as the Arab regimes themselves represent their own people. There is no... They've alienated themselves. I don't know how. They're probably living in ivory towers, or they're probably living off of the type of hype that they get from meeting some officials here and there.
Well, we know where they're living. They're living on K Street and Capitol Hill and conventions.
Well, I think for their own sake, they should step down and be with the people, understand what the people are thinking, where the people are at.
You know that's not going to happen. Well, what's your view of Zogby? But come on, straightforward, what's your view? I use my words, you use whatever words you want to use.
Well, I think I said this before, and I'm going to say it again. I don't know him on a personal level. I have, I guess, like any other concerned and committed Muslim in this country, we followed his interviews, his statements, his types of conduct and interaction with the events, and he turns out to be, at least at the beginning, it seems like he was a person who was trying to push a just cause, the cause of the Palestinians, the cause of the whole injustice in the Middle East. But as the years went on, it appears that at least he should by now have enough common sense to say, look, I tried, I thought it could work diplomatically and politically to push for this cause, but I can see that it is not working. We have not managed.
But you're being very generous. Here's a man who claims to represent Arab American interests in this country. You're not going to change him. He knows what he's doing. He's not an unintelligent person. What's your view of him? I didn't ask you for a personal view. You don't. I asked you for a judgment as to what he does and what he represents.
You know, he should be overthrown, just like the kings and the presidents in the Arab countries have to be overthrown, because there is no social contract between him and the segments of the Arab population in this country.
Does he have any following in the Arab American community?
Absolutely not. I don't think, at least where I go, that the people, I can tell you, I would not be able to say these words comfortably 8 or 9 years ago.
No, let's deal with today.
Yeah, no, today I'm saying them very
We've all
clearly.
grown,
If
matured, and learned. That's why we're here talking to each other.
Right. If this person wants to come down to the level of the people, we're willing to meet him anywhere, anytime, and tell him you've gone off course. You know, your diplomacy and all of this right now is hypocrisy. It's time for you to say, look, it's enough. But if you're not going to do it, and you're getting a lot of largesse, you're getting a lot of contacts, you're getting a lot of this otherworldly type of existence among diplomats and politicians, and okay,
Jim is paid to do what he does.
If that's the case, if that is the case, and if we know that is the case, he's setting himself up for a reaction by the people. I mean, it'll be a nasty ending for him, just like it's going to be for the heads of states in the Arab countries.
The reason I focus on him is that for the average American in Ohio or Minnesota or California, Jim Zogby is the voice of Arab Americans from Washington. And yet you're telling me he represents no one other than the regimes that pay him.
That's right. He has as much support among the Arab American or Muslim American community as the Saudi Arabian government has support among its own people, or as the Jordanian government has support among its own people, or as the other Arab countries and governments have support among their own people.
Speaking of Saudi Arabia, what's your view of Prince Bandar, who has had a tremendous impact on events in Washington in the last 15 years?
Well, Prince Bandar is a clear case of a person who actually deserves to be put away.
Put away where? You promised me you wouldn't pull your punches. Come on, what is it you're saying?
Well, you know...
Remember, this is Mideast Realities, public access TV, and it's the opposite of normal TV. Here, if you say the truth and don't pull your punches, we invite you back. Otherwise, we won't. Now, come on, I asked you about Prince Bandar, who's probably the most successful Arab American ambassador in history, a man who's had tremendous impact on the politics of this country and world affairs, all the way from Afghanistan to the Gulf War. And your first reaction is he should be put away? A clear example of a man who should be put away? What are you saying?
This person has demonstrated his treason publicly. He doesn't shy from making public statements on camera with high-profile programs such as 60 Minutes or the different correspondents who ran interviews with him. He doesn't have any compunctions about saying that he has worked for the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, his family.
His family.
Entire family works.
For the Central Intelligence Agency. Well, you know, him and his family, they, you know, it's just like a slave plantation in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the citizens of Saudi Arabia are called Saudis. It's like having a slave master who runs not only a little plantation, but here you're running a piece of real estate in the world that has 1/4 or 1/3 of the reserves of oil in it. And here you have every citizen of that country designated by the family name that you have.
Yeah, in the old days it was Arabia, but in more modern
Now
history it's Saudi
They say
Arabia.
The person is a Saudi. They don't say he's an Arabian. He's a Saudi, meaning...
But this also goes back to 1918. It also goes back to the Paris Peace Conference. It also goes back to the West choosing, do we back the Saudis, do we back the Hashemites, do we back... And in the end, they backed them all. They just gave them different, they just carved up different places, and they gave the Emir of Kuwait, Kuwait. And they gave the Saudis, Saudi Arabia, and they gave the Hashemites the remains, at the time, Transjordan and Iraq. But this is now, we're getting into strong language. Treasonous character, from what I hear you saying.
That's right.
A man who has sold out his birthright and his interests. I'm not
Like
talking
no
about
other.
his family, like no other.
That's right. Big time. This person, in that book, Bob Woodward wrote that book, Veil, and he speaks about the assassination attempt in Beirut against Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlullah. That was financed by none other than Banda himself. This person had his hands in so many deaths in the Middle East, attempted plots of assassination and the rest of these intrigues, that I challenge him to be an ordinary person and speak to the ordinary public.
He wouldn't have the slightest idea.
Let me remind him, he's familiar with Islamic history, and some of your viewers may be familiar with Islamic history. Omar, who was the second successor to the Prophet, had no security agents around him. At one time, there was a person who came from outside of the city, and he was asking for this ruler of the Muslims. And they pointed to him. He was sleeping under a tree, and he had a little rock as his pillow. And the guy looked, the guy who came from outside of this habitat, this Arabian habitat, he looked and said, "Where's the security?" Now, contrast that. This guy, Bandar, and his family claim to represent the Islamic system, Islamic values. That claim is similar to the Zionists saying we represent Judaism or Jewish values. So this Saudi problem is the equivalent of the Zionist problem within the Jewish context.
Whew, now you're really throwing a lot at me. This is Mideast Realities. I'm your host, Mark Brzezinski, and we're talking with Mohamed Alassi. Mohamed was the elected imam at the Islamic Mosque here in Washington, D.C., but much more importantly, he's an extremely knowledgeable, thoughtful, and informed Arab American and Islamic American who has a very deep insight into the affairs of the Middle East, the realities of the Middle East, and the realities of the Middle East as they relate to Washington, D.C., where we're speaking. My perspective on Bandar is a little different because I came at it from a whole different side. I first met him when Al-Hegelan was the ambassador, and I knew Al-Hegelan. They had this unpretentious embassy on 18th Street near DuPont Circle. And then, fairly quickly, Bandar took over, got rid of Al-Hegelan, bought up the big building down near the State Department, hired Fred Dutton, who was Bobby Kennedy's campaign manager, and paid him a great deal of money to help him find the ways to get things done in Washington. But he transformed a dignified and low-key Saudi presence in Washington into a flamboyant, extravagant presence. And the recent stories of what he did, not only did he build this mansion out in McLean, but when he didn't feel the mansion was big enough, and it already was one of the biggest in the whole area, if not the biggest in the whole area, he bought the mansion next door, not because he wanted to expand the house, but he just wanted a bigger view. So he tore down the $2 million mansion next door and just put grass all over the place. And I recall being at his at this residence early on when he first took over for a meeting with a small group of people. And you talk about people being treated as servants. Even the hired help, in this case it was Fred Dutton, well-paid attorney, was turned into the equivalent of someone who sat on the side, and every time there was a need for coffee or anything else, it was Fred's job to go find the servants who would then bring it. No question that the Saudi family is despotic, is corrupt, is totally unrepresentative of the people of the country or of the region. And yet they have so much power and so much money, and Bandar's influence on the affairs in Washington and on the Gulf War. I'll go so far as to say that I'm not sure there would have been the Gulf War had it not been for Bandar intervening on the behalf of the Americans, the Israelis, and the CIA with the royal family, and sort of imposing American forces on the kingdom. You're shaking your head in agreement, I take it.
Absolutely. He was the pivotal person in bringing about the different forces that were necessary to put together that grand alliance of firepower that brought about the Gulf War #2.
The other change he made is that early on, at first secretly and then more overtly, unlike his predecessor ambassadors, Bandar very quickly made deals with the Zionist and Israeli lobbies and very quickly started working with them. And by the time of the Gulf War, this wasn't a war of just Iraq against Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. It was a war of America and Israel in alliance with its client regimes against Arab nationalism, the kind of Arab nationalism I spoke of before, secularism, Baathism. Now, just a few years later, it's hard to know where to take this conversation. The Middle East and Washington have become so complicated that day is night and war is peace, and people claiming to be representatives are in reality representing no one, like Zogby. It's a town of, it's like the invasion of the body snatchers almost. And it started taking place in the 70s and 80s. Now, more from you about the Arab American scene. Who does represent legitimate Arab American interests in this country? Who should the press be talking to?
Well, this is the dilemma of it. We have to be practical here. I'm not going to entertain any illusions about, even though my instinct would like to go in that direction, but the condition of Arab Americans in this country is like an orphan. Those who have the money claim to represent them, and that is not true. Those who don't have the money and would like to represent them don't, because they simply don't have the wherewithal to do that. So the condition of Arab Americans, the condition of Muslims in this country, is that of an orphan. There is no one that represents them.
What about ADC, which at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, which first of all isn't on K Street, and second of all, at least does have some grassroots? What's your view of it?
Well, let me put it this way. ADC had what may be called grassroots. And they had that grassroots simply because of the climaxing that took place in the late 70s and early 80s. It was off of that trend, off of that momentum.
People needed somewhere to go.
That's right. And
once a year.
Right. Someone came across with, broad statements. The Palestinian issue should be supported. Something should be done. We should, open up our energies and begin contact.
There was no real substance to it, but at least the statements weren't so terrible.
That's right. They were, in a sense, they were attractive. And so that's why they had grassroots at that time. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it's been going downhill. And I think it would take...
Very far downhill.
Right now, it's almost bottoming off.
There's not much left.
That's right.
Right.
And if they... I've come in contact with some of them who represented ABC. Some of them are really nice people. But we're not looking for nice people as much as we are looking for the social contract that has been absent in Arab reality almost for uncountable generations.
Okay. But by social contract, do you mean, if I can sum it up, honest and capable people who represent legitimate concerns of their community?
The hopes and the frustrations of their community.
And you have not one organization to go to.
I say this regrettably, but it's...